officials and our participating localities in our technical committee, which is the representatives of our technical transportation staff from those local governments. My name is Bob Crum. I want to welcome everybody again to the regional building in HRPDC, HRTPO, and we have Kevin here, also HR TAC, who is the funder of the Regional Connector Study. Before I get started, we're in a little bit of a transition with our chair position here at the RCS. So my job for today is to get us started and walk us through the process. You'll have a couple of options today. One may be to elect a chair pro tem for today, which I'd be happy to serve that role if you see fit. That might give you a little bit of the time to determine who you'd like to elect as your next chair of this regional connector study. But before we get to that point, I thought what might be helpful would be for us just to go around the room and do introductions before we get started. And I'll be taking role as we do that. But Mayor Jones, welcome, sir. Would you mind starting us off with an intro, and then we'll go the whole way around the thing.
Thanks so much for having me. For those who haven't met me, I'm the new mayor of Newport News, Philip B. Jones. Really excited. It's always good to see old friends, and really excited to work together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron, still if you've used engineering.
I am Rick West, Mayor of Chesapeake. Martin Thomas, Vice Mayor, City of Norfolk.
Donnie Tuck, Mayor Hampton.
Steve Jones, Naval Station, Norfolk.
Bobby Dyer, Mayor, Virginia Beach.
Kevin Page, Executive Director, HR Tech.
Jason Souders, City of Suffolk Public Works Department.
Dorian Allen, Strategic Transportation Planner, City of Norfolk.
Carl Jackson, City of Portsmouth Planning.
Good afternoon, Kathy Vick with the Port of Virginia. Good afternoon, Barbara Nelson, Port of Virginia.
Mike Gibbon, Mayor, Suffolk.
Rick Lemon, City of Virginia Beach Public Works Department.
Strasburg, City of Chesapeake, Traffic Engineering.
Joe Strange, with Michael Baker.
Lauren Harkins with Michael Baker, Consultant Project Manager.
And Paul Prideaux, also with Michael Baker.
HRTPO.
Camelia Ravenbach, RCS Project Coordinator.
And if we could have our audience introduce themselves, please.
Stephanie Strand, City of Hampton.
Mitzi Crystal, VDOT Planning.
Sandra Kuschersberger, VDOT Environmental.
Robert Cruz, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Norfolk District.
Todd Nichols, Deputy Executive Director for the Hampton Roads Military and Federal Facilities Alliance.
Will Schwano, Transportation Engineer, HRTPO.
Kyle Gilmer, HRTPO.
Dale Stitt, HRTPO.
Good afternoon, Kwame McLaurin, BEI Liaison for HRTPO and HRPDC.
Great, thank you, everyone. So on to, and excited to report that we have quorums for both our policy committee and for our working technical committee. That leads us to item number 3. And my question for the policy members is whether you would be prepared to make a nomination for a chair today, or if you'd like to elect a chair pro tem to facilitate today's meeting, to give you some time to think about who that person should be.
I haven't spoken to Mayor Dyer, but I think he'd be an excellent candidate.
I accept the baton.
We have a motion and a second to elect Mayor Bobby Dyer from Virginia Beach to be the chair of the RCS Policy Committee. Any further nominations? We could call a vote. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Mayor Dyer, you now have a seat at the front table, sir.
The euchre seat, yes.
Does that mean he has to be on time for meetings?
Do we have a motion to adjourn? Thank you. Thank you. They always told me in the Marine Corps, never volunteer, right? But this is an honor. And I tell you what, it is a privilege to work among you. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, our next item would be the public comment period. I would recommend we call for any public comments from the audience. No written comments were received in advance of today's meeting. And anyone who would like to address the regional connector study committees. Sir, seeing none, I'll turn it back over to you for consideration of the minutes.
Okay, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Do we have a second? Okay, vote's open. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, and then next, I guess we're moving on to the regional connector study phase 3. Step 2, congestion evaluation, economic impacts for tier 1 and 2 segments.
Very good. So we're going to ask our Michael Baker team to come to the podium. Lorna Parkins will start us off with support from Paul Trudeau, our RCS project co-managers. Lorna, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Well, thank you all for the opportunity to share some of our updated progress and results this morning, or this afternoon. I guess it's already afternoon. Before I start, I do want to mention that we brought some decorations with us. You'll see the meeting boards over here in this part of the room are from the public meetings that we held over the past 2 weeks. And we thought you all might enjoy the opportunity to see those materials that we shared with the public. I'll talk more about how the meetings went and what we heard from the public during my presentation. But just letting you know, if you have time when we're finished, you're more than welcome to take a closer look at those. So let me begin with a quick reminder of our phase 3 process and where we are in that series of 4 steps that we're taking to complete our study throughout phase 3. So we've completed step 1 and we've completed step 2. And those were the periods of time in which we were looking at all the segments, completing our evaluations, and it culminated with your November meeting at which we determined a draft tiering of the segments, and I'll go over that in a moment. Subsequent to that are the public meetings, which we just held, and now we're moving into step 3, where we're doing our scenario analysis and traffic operations analysis. And today's meeting does not include any decisions. It's really just an update to give you a look at how that step 3 analysis is going, and also take the opportunity to share with you some of what we heard in our public engagement. So that brings you to pretty much an overview of the agenda for today. And so I'll start with a progress update, then go into some specific analytical results that we have, and then we'll talk about how the public engagement it took place over the last 2 weeks, what we heard, and how that went, and how that continues with our online open house that kicks off here momentarily. So as always, we begin with a little bit of vocabulary, just to remind you. What you see on the screen right now on this slide is the original, what we call the mandated segments. And as you may recall, last summer, based on our initial readiness evaluation, qualitative evaluation, and also kind of events around the advancement of segment 1B, which is I-664 widening from Bowers Hill to College Drive. We moved segment 1B, the southern part of the I-64 corridor, into our baseline network. So that's now included as something that's assumed to be funded when we test all of our alternatives. And so our analysis now focuses on all the other 5 segments, but only 1A in the case of the I-664 widening. The next thing I just want to remind you of is that the segments, like we were just talking about, are the individual potential projects. And then when we do our analysis in our travel demand and economic models, we have to test the networks. So we can't just put one segment in and take it out. We have to work in bundles so that we're testing networks that are logical and complete. So I'll review with you the bundles that we are testing in the current analysis. So those are combinations of segments. And then the next important part of our vocabulary is tiering, right? And it's important to recall at the beginning of phase 3, back in January of 2021, we made an important change of direction. And instead of ending the study with one recommended alternative, that is a selection of the segments, we pivoted with this group's, as the decision of this group to tier the segments. So all of the segments remain in our recommendations, but they fall into different tiers. And in the last meeting of this group in November, the tiers were consolidated to tier 1 and tier 2. So the way that we're concluding the study is with those draft recommendations, where tier 1 recommendations do well on readiness, they're ready to move forward, and they appear to be more cost effective with their benefits relative to their costs. Segments that require more refinement, that have readiness issues that must be resolved over time, or have other hurdles to advancing, those are the tier 2 recommendations. And the way that tier 1 and tier 2 are defined per this committee's decisions in November are that tier 1 recommendations are recommended for HRTPO to evaluate in the 2050 long-range transportation plan. So they would be candidate projects that go through the HRTPO's transportation planning process and prioritization. Tier 2 are segments that are recommended to be included in the transportation vision plan. So they appear in the plan as needs that don't fit within the fiscally constrained plan, but because they are in the plan as identified needs, they're eligible for further study. So that's, as you recall then, what this committee approved on November 17th was to recommend segments 1A and 2 for tier 1, segments 3, 4, and 5 for tier 2, and then you directed the consultant team to move forward with our current analysis, first of all, to analyze 3 bundles of tier 1 and 2 segments in the scenario analysis, and then secondly, to analyze tier 1 segments in traffic operations analysis. So if you remember back to the 4-step diagram, those are the 2 main things we're doing in step 3, and this was the direction we were given to proceed. So we are proceeding. Both of those activities are underway, but we have completed sort of the summary regional benefits analysis for congestion and economic benefits. And so we just wanted to come together today to give you a first look at that. So let me start with just kind of a little bit of history from within this project. Back in phase 2 and phase 1, we developed regional scenarios. We call them greater growth scenarios because what this group decided to do in creating the scenarios for study, not only in this study, but also in parallel in the HRTPO long-range transportation planning process. We looked at that growth forecast from 2015 to 2045 and determined that the most useful way to create kind of a stress test for proposed transportation improvements was to add more growth into these scenarios. So what we do in the scenario analysis is we compare the results for congestion for the 2045 baseline level of growth, which is kind of that lower line that you see in the graph, to the results that we get with those 3 greater growth scenarios, and I'll describe them in a moment. But they reflect 2 times the amount of employment growth that was originally forecast from 2015 to 2045, and then the associated additional growth in population. And this really allows us to test, what could happen if the region grows faster or if different economic engines begin to take root in the region over time and result in different transportation demands, so that we are not basing our outlook in the future on just one fairly conservative estimation of growth in the future. And so what we've been tasked with doing is looking at up to 3 bundles that are made of tier 1 and tier 2 segments for the scenario analysis. And I'll show you which bundles we're testing in just a moment. So the 3 greater growth scenarios each kind of have a theme. The first one is greater growth on water. And this scenario looks at increased economic activity, around the harbor area within the region, Some of the economic assumptions include growth in Navy employment, growth in Port of Virginia activity. At the same time, more sort of free market, more dispersed housing locations. And that, in theory, was intended to test more cross-harbor travel, put more pressure on the harbor crossings. And then the second scenario is greater growth in urban centers. Sometimes we call it greater urban growth for short. That one has more economic diversification and more sort of a transit-oriented pattern of development in that one. And that one's intended to test more urban and multimodal travel patterns. And you'll see there's consistently less overall travel in that scenario. And then the third scenario is greater suburban and greenfield growth, or greater suburban growth for short. And that one has more dispersed growth regionally, but it does still have kind of activity centers. That one also has more Port of Virginia growth in it. And that scenario consistently has the most travel in it. So that gives us different ways of evaluating what could happen in the future so that we know that the choices we make for future investments can be more resilient. So these scenarios were approved by the policy committee back in 2019. We did a whole series of analysis, kind of the baseline transportation network back at that time. That's all on our website. And what we're doing now is we're taking these same scenarios and we're testing the tier 1 and tier 2 bundle combinations in order to gain some additional insight into what kind of congestion and economic benefits we might have if the future brings more growth. So at the end of the last meeting of this group, we were instructed to select, the consultant team was instructed to select 3 bundles to study. And we had put together 4 bundles altogether, and bundle A was just segment 1A. And then bundles B, C, and D, as you see here, are different combinations of adding east-west facilities. So bundle B is really just the tier 1 draft recommended projects. So that's segment 1A and 2. Bundle C is the straight across the harbor combination, again with 1A because you need that in order to connect to the 664 widening and also get all the way across the harbor with the I-564 connector as well. So the 664 connector and the 564 connector make up the cross harbor part of this one. And then bundle D is, again, segment 1A, and this time with segment 2, 3, and 4, which is another way of getting across the harbor. So we felt that these 3 would give us the most insight as we think about running the scenarios with the different land use patterns. These allow us to test all of the segments in different combinations. They're all accounted for by choosing this 3 sets of bundles. So what we're doing, again, just to emphasize, when we do the scenario planning stress test, one way of looking at it is if you see the figure on the left side of the slide, that's sort of depicting the increases in transportation demand that we can test through this approach. So our baseline land use has one level of future transportation system demand, and then each of the greater growth scenarios adds more and more transportation demand to the system. So that's one part of the stress test. And then the other thing that we're testing in this exercise is different levels of cross-harbor capacity, right? So what you see on the right side of the diagram is the baseline network doesn't include any of the 5 segments that we're currently testing. Bundle B adds 2 segments, bundle C adds 3 segments, and then bundle D is 4 segments. So what you get is increasing cross-harbor capacity with each successive bundle. And what we do then is we test all of the land use alternatives with all of the bundles to perform that stress test. So it's a lot of information. I promise I'm not going to make you look at any 4x4 matrices of results, but we have been able to gain a lot of insight from doing all of these model runs and looking at the differences in the results. So I'm going to start with just some takeaways, and then I really just have a couple of charts to show you that provide a little bit of the backup on this. So the first takeaway is really that comparing the benefits to the costs, Bundle B, which is the tier 1 segments, really does consistently deliver the best results. So if we're putting ourselves in that framework of cost effectiveness, Bundle B is continuing to perform very well as it did with just the baseline network, or baseline land use, excuse me. Then the other thing, as I've alluded in my introduction of the scenarios, we do see that the total amount of travel is impacted much more by the land use scenarios than by the bundles themselves. So, so there might be some differences in the amount of travel if we provide a lot more capacity in one bundle. But the differences in land use that we have in these scenarios really is the driver of where we see a lot more demand happening. And that's really one of the points of this exercise, is to say, do we see different benefits if we find that we do have more transportation demand in the future? The next insight is that, again, as you might expect, there is more congestion overall with the greater growth scenario. So there's more demand and there's more congestion in the future if we look at those scenarios that have more growth, particularly as you go up the line from one scenario to the next, as we saw in the earlier chart. And then finally, when we do have more congestion in those scenarios, we also see additional benefits from the segments. And in particular, Bundle D, which has the most capacity, it also brings the most benefit in terms of just looking straight at the congestion benefits. As it says in the first talking point, when you compare those benefits to the costs of providing the capacity, we still see the tier 1 segments performing best. So cost effectiveness is holding up in terms of 664 widening and segment 2, but it is important to know that if there is more growth in the future, you see more benefits with the additional crossing segments. And let me just illustrate that with a couple of charts. So this chart is the total societal benefits for each of the scenarios, and then the bars that you see represent the different bundles relative to the baseline. So what we're doing is we're comparing, the gray bar compares the societal benefits to the baseline land use scenario. And I'm sorry, to the baseline transportation network. Okay, so so in other words, let's just take the very first gray bar. What we're saying is, with the baseline land use forecast for 2045, Bundle B, the gray bar, has $400 million in societal benefits, greater than if we didn't make any investments in the regional connectors. So this illustrates that last point that I had on the slide, that with more growth and more, with that growth, more congestion, you start to see more benefits from all of the segments. And it's interesting to note that greater growth on the water in particular tends to enhance the benefits of the segments. That has the highest bars. So what does that mean? That means that if, as we move into the future and growth is happening in the region, if that growth begins to resemble greater growth on water, that suggests that the need for more capacity for regional connectors will happen sooner. And whereas if there's more compact and urban development, that would tend to delay the need to move forward with additional regional connectors. So that's one way of looking at what we're doing in the stress test, is just kind of putting in perspective what kind of growth will accelerate the need for additional regional connectors. Okay. And then this last slide is the cost effectiveness. So these bars look different because what we've done here is we've taken those societal benefits, and I meant to define societal benefit for you. Let me do that real quick. Societal benefits is the monetized value of the cost savings for people and businesses and overall society from the reduced transportation costs and improved air quality, for example, that derive from having reduced congestion and improved travel reliability. So It's taking those transportation benefits that we get as measured in our travel demand model and then translating them to the overall benefit to society for having greater mobility and reliability. So in this slide, what we're looking at is taking that societal benefit and comparing it to the cost of the improvements. Because as we've noted, bundle B, which is the gray bar, is only segment 1A and segment 2, so it has a lot lower cost than bundles C and D. So when you compare those benefits that we saw in the previous slide to the cost of the projects, it looks like, and you index it, it looks like this. And this is the talking point I made earlier, which is that we see the most benefit relative to cost for bundle B, which is the 2 tier 1 projects, regardless of future scenario. But again, you see the greater growth on the water shows how the other regional crossing benefits are inching up in cost effectiveness.
Excuse me.
consistent with what we said.
I'm sorry, I thought I understood. I thought I understood the graphs. But if I go back to the preceding ones, the societal benefits in 2045, and I'm not sure what I'm looking at, if you're saying that bundle, there we go. There we go. I see. We're good. Thank you.
It's a lot, yeah, it's about comparing to the cost, right?
No, I saw bundle D as bundle B.
Oh.
Up until the last one, I was trying to go, oh, what am I looking at? And now I understand. I was thinking it was bundle B because everything else we were talking about bundle B. And we get this one here and it's a D instead of a B. So my fault.
Bundle D is green, bundle C is yellow.
Well, no,
bundle B is
I see it
red.
now. Now I can understand, but I was thinking that everything else was bundle B is bundle B. And then there I'm thinking bundle B has the greatest, until the last one I'm saying, oh, wait, how's that? And then I saw your next line, and so it threw me off. So I gotta keep B and D separate. We're good. Thank you.
You bet, it is complicated, so thank you for taking the time to understand it. And I welcome your question. So that's the end of the preview of our regional congestion and economic benefits. And I'll just say for myself, I think these results, reinforce the value of the 2 tiers that we've placed the projects in and show that, over time, depending on how the region grows, there could be either accelerated or decelerated need in the future for additional resources.
Any other questions or comments at this point? No, I think that, oh, yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. One question, Lorna, I was just curious to see how Bundle C, in fact, fared with regard to congestion, since you are building a new, east-west crossing, and whether or not that might play a factor in the overall societal benefits. I understand it may not be a cost-effective alternative, but it does seem to be, have other societal benefits, and it might even be inevitable to have that full crossing of 564.
I think what you're saying is a good validation of what the results are here, if I understand you correctly, Carl. The congestion results look very similar to these results. And the congestion results are the driver of these benefits that we're talking about here, because the way that we do our analysis is we run these transportation alternatives through the transportation travel demand model, and those differences in travel time savings, reliability, speed, trip length, all of those different transportation results go into the economic model, and that's the basis of the economic benefits. You're exactly right. What we're seeing is that with more growth, there is more societal benefit from the crossings that are not in tier 1, but they're not as costly, but they remain less cost effective.
Yeah, and I understand that. I thank you for pointing that out. But I guess what I'm saying, it would have been nice to see just that apples to oranges comparison, or apples to apples comparison, I guess, of bundle B and bundle C. Because again, I guess there's just an assumption that bundle B is the best bundle, but from what I'm seeing at C, that seems to provide the better benefit. If you take cost out, if you take cost effectiveness out, bundle C with that full 564 crossing seems to be the better alternative.
It depends on the scenario. So it is actually the case that Bundle C does better in suburban growth, but Bundle D does better in rural and urban. Yep. Yes, indeed.
Okay, anyone else? Well, obviously, this is a complex problem with a, require a complex solution to it. But I think the thing is that we maybe perhaps could all agree that we're gonna be looking for growth in our region. With the broadband coming in, with the cables coming in, they're gonna benefit anybody. We're hoping, to bring more companies, and that's gonna bring more people down here. So I think it's a good, I think it's prudent enough for us at this point to play chess, not checkers, and look ahead, to make sure that we have a plan in place as this, I'm confident that the growth is gonna be happening in the region. Yeah, Bob.
Lorna, thank you for the briefing. So as we take a look at sort of interim steps and then long-term steps, as everybody's well aware, one of the primary sources we have for funding regional transportation priorities in Hampton Roads is our friends at HR TAC, and many of you sit on Kevin's board. But of course, what the Code of Virginia does require is we can only spend HR TAC monies on those projects with maximum congestion relief. So that sort of leads me more than I'm sure the team has it, but maybe it's something you could prepare. It might be interesting to see, and this sort of goes to Carl's point, right? Looking at the impact of all the options and what the congestion relief value would be of the different bundles.
Yeah, it looks very much the same as, it's in line with the societal benefits, but we'll give you, in our full briefing when we're done, we will give you all of those statistics as well.
Thank you.
But it is definitely the case that the more capacity you provide, the more benefit you get. And that is more accentuated when you look at those futures that have more growth.
Okay, great, thank you, and I think you're on deck for the next segment, correct?
Yes, I'm gonna give you the update on the public engagement that we just held.
Well, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Donnie, I'm sorry.
Well, no problem, and maybe I can wait till after the whole presentation's over. But I just a few things keep coming to mind, and I'll wait till you finish this part. I'll wait.
Okay. Okay, so we held pop-up meetings a few weeks ago, 3 of them in the jurisdictions where we didn't hold the public meetings. Oops, I need to advance the slide, sorry. So we started our public engagement with these pop-up meetings that were held in public libraries in Hampton and Virginia Beach and Chesapeake. And then we proceeded to a series of 4 open house meetings that were held in the evenings in Norfolk, Newport News, Portsmouth, and Suffolk over the last 2 weeks. So the numbers you see in the circles are the numbers of public attendees that we had at each, and so that was a total attendance of about 68 folks. And it was really good diversity in the attendees. We had everything from high school and college students to you've always got your retired citizens with kind of a technical interest in what we're doing. We had some of those, and certainly people who live along the corridors and really wanted to take a look at what potential impacts might be, which was a big part of the conversation that we were hoping to have. So that was really great engagement, good input. To put we picked a few themes of that we heard in the comments that that folks made to us face to face or in their initial comment forms over these last 2 weeks. Let me give you some of those highlights. One topic, of course, was congestion, and we certainly heard everything from people concerned that we would induce more demand by building new facilities. To people saying that there's already too much congestion, we need this relief, why are these projects out in the future? We need them now. There were several comments around tolls, asking that we don't increase tolls, that we find other ways of funding projects in the region. We were very careful to explain that the only tolls that we were studying were the managed lanes on I-664 widening. we had a lot of folks there who wanted to talk about alternatives to personal vehicles. And, you know, some of this is sort of just wanting other ways to get around. Why don't we have more light rail, that kind of comment, which could be broadened to asking for more investment in public transit. But along with that, people were saying that the buses are, it's very slow to get around on buses in this region. And so other types of transit that would better replace the automobile are needed. And people also were interested in rail, intercity rail, and ferries. So it's always interesting when you meet somebody who comes from another part of the country, like the Seattle region or the New York region or someplace. Their perspective is shaped by that for sure. But you know, we always try to put those comments in context here locally. And then quite a few comments on the environment, comments about climate change and flooding. People, you know, kind of telling us the history of the region and the environmental impacts, and talking about pollution and sort of concerns. Certainly in Norfolk, we heard concerns about the trucks on Hampton Boulevard as an example of kind of a pollution and safety concern. So, so lots of input on environmental impacts. And then the way that we presented the materials, and you'll see this if you look at the boards, we really were emphasizing that we wanted to hear from them about what they see the benefits of the projects being, and then also what are the burdens of the projects and how do you balance the two? The burdens being the kinds of impacts that will happen to people who might be affected by, say, widening one of the highways, or if they perceive, congestion, to be a problem one way or the other, thinking about air quality, et cetera. So what are the burdens? What we heard from some folks really helped helped us to begin developing ideas about what we can document in this stage of the study and carry forward to help with that important issue. And one of the reasons that issue is very important is because where we are widening existing facilities, there are potential environmental justice impacts. So that means that low income and minority communities may be adversely affected and maybe even disproportionately affected, depending on what we learn in later stages of study. And so thinking ahead to how to balance the benefits and burdens is very important. So some of the things that we heard about were looking at how environmental improvements could be made in those communities. For example, addressing any existing flooding issues or anticipated future flooding issues. That's a way for the dollars spent in a project to bring benefit to those communities. Another example, and I'm actually going to give Carl credit for this because he mentioned it in a prior meeting we had, is thinking about accelerating the construction schedule. If the burden for the surrounding community is the issues they face during construction, then maybe we can spend a little bit more to accelerate construction, and that's a way to balance that out. So we're going to move forward, as you'll see in a moment in our schedule slide, to a regional symposium to talk more about that question of how to balance the benefits and burdens for environmental justice communities. And the last thing I want to talk about that we heard from the public is a lot of people asked questions about what's the timeline for a project. If something is in tier 1 and it moves forward to the fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan, how soon would it be built? And so we were careful to explain that, first of all, a lot of projects are already in the pipeline for funding and we have to get in line behind those. And then there's a project development timeline as well that you can see on this slide. It's probably easier to read in your hand without the right colors. But, oh yeah, thank you. So it starts with, at the end of this study, we ask for the HRTPO to consider it for the long-range plan. If it moves forward in the fiscally constrained long-range plan, then you enter a phase that is called planning and environmental linkages. Sometimes we would call that alternatives analysis. And that's where you do a lot of the more detailed engineering and impact analysis and engagement so that you can narrow down your list of choices to one final corridor. One of the reasons for doing that is that the NEPA timeline, which is what comes next, the environmental impact statement process, by federal law, that has been, or federal regulation, that's been shortened to 2 years. So with that being the case, you've got to get a lot of things worked out in that planning and environmental linkages phase. Once you do the formal environmental impact analysis, that's when the CTV formally selects the alternative to move forward. Then you go into a period of time that varies in how long it takes to actually get the project fully funded, do the preliminary engineering design, select your project delivery method, and then get through design and construction. So we let people know that getting through all of those steps takes at least 10 years and can easily take 20 years. And we certainly use other examples of projects that are now under construction and how long that can take. So just to let you all know from your constituents' perspective, this is a big question for them to understand so that they can put the findings of this study in perspective. And then the last thing on public engagement is that we are starting an online open house. It is scheduled to launch today. I think we're still working on a couple of details, but hopefully by the end of today, certainly no later than tomorrow, we'll have all of our project materials in an online open house that includes survey questions that people can fill out to give us their feedback, which we can combine with the feedback that we got in the public meetings. And we're gonna run that for 3 weeks through March 6th, so that anybody who didn't have a chance to attend the meetings or didn't know about the meetings, we'll continue our social media campaign to publicize this, and we certainly encourage any of you who have, your own distribution lists through email or social media to continue helping us publicize the online open house to increase our feedback. Any questions about the public engagement?
Mayor Tuck,
Not about the public meeting, but just maybe about where we are in this whole process. And I guess, last evening I was looking at the notes in preparation for today. And we go back to 2017. In the course of that, at least 3 years, I guess I've been active, maybe 4 years I've been active in this body. Seems like there's this pool, I guess, controversy over including certain segments. And we kept them in as part of the vision plan, because that's if all things are equal, and if we get this pot of money drops from the sky, we can fund all these projects. But the one challenge I think that's still in there with respect to this I-564 connector, and I used to work with the city of Norfolk in public works, so I understand the desire to get this truck traffic off of Hampton Boulevard. But, and of course, we've got Army Corps at the table, we've got the Norfolk Naval Base at the table. But how do we get past their concerns about security, about the fuel depot, and about some other things? And then another thought is that we're expected to use the express lanes to pay for the improvements we're doing in our region. And we're talking about building the spur. They can't be told. So that doesn't help us as far as what we're trying to do. In fact, the spur may take traffic off of 664, which takes it out of our total network, which affects our ability to repay the bonds. So I just don't know if today's the day, because I keep looking through the documents and I see where there are motions for inclusion, motions to take out, and we continue to include it. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just trying to figure out, what is feasible and how we get past some of the legitimate concerns about 564 connector.
any response?
I have a couple of thoughts. Did you want to go first?
So Mayor, when the last steering committee meeting, the consultant team had recommended having the 564, 664, and the 164 connector in tier 3, just because there were a lot of the questions that remained to be answered. Again, the Navy, the City of Norfolk, the Port, all of them have provided their feedback to help us get there. But the when we had the discussion with the committee during the last meeting, one of the reasons why we thought it would be good to include these three segments, the 564, 664, and the cranial 164 connector, was that when we put it in our vision plan. So vision plan is those projects that are just unfunded needs for our region, they're unfunded priorities. And we keep them there in case there's some funding that becomes available. We can then use those projects and study them. Now, as Lorna's slide showed, there's still a lot of unknowns with our projects. What we're trying to do is keeping them in our planning process. We don't take them out, allows them tomorrow, if there's more federal funding, allows them to pursue that. If the project is not even included in our tier 2, it kind of pushes it back further. And with a lot of the federal funds or state funds, having that in our vision plan just helps us make the case like this is a regional priority, it's just we've not been able to find the funds for it. So that's why we decided, or the committee decided to say, okay, the tier 1, which was your 664 widening and the 164 widening, we seem to know more information about those, and some of the challenges are not as onerous as the tier 2 segments. Hopefully that answered the question, but that's kind of where we are right now. When we started the study, I think, we were thinking, let's just go with one recommendation. But when you look at the funding landscape, the priorities of our region, and we look at growth and the growing port, we just thought we need more time. And again, this study is still a very high-level planning study. More is needed before any of these projects. You need to evaluate them technically. They might be environmental challenges, or stakeholders need to be on board. There's a lot to do before we get there. Keeping them in tier 2 allows us to do that.
And I would just add to that, so you asked, how do we get past the concerns about the naval base security and things like that? So what we have done in this study is where we can make a concrete adjustment to the segment, such as shifting the segment 3, which is the Virginia 164 connector, away from the Navy fuel depot. We did do that. And then, so what we found from this study is a modified segment alignment. And then we've also documented all of those concerns. And to the extent possible, we've taken the things that make construction more complex into account in the way that we did our cost estimates. So we kind of allowed that that's going to cost more when that takes place. And that, again, it affects the cost effectiveness results. So we are doing some things in this study, at least to document what we've learned. The Navy has provided very detailed comments that will carry forward until, if there is such a time, as the leader said, that there's an impetus for picking up and studying one of those segments. At least they'll have a good documentation of what concerns them.
Hey, anyone else? Lauren, I think you did great. I think you got to wrap up.
Yep, very brief. So here's the 4 steps again, and I apologize, the red arrows are not quite where I was aiming them, but we're finishing up step 3. We're doing the traffic operational analysis, which means just taking a detailed look at the tier 1 segments to make sure that they'll function the way we think they should. And if we need to do further refinements to the design and the cost estimates that on the basis of what we learned there, we'll do that before we're done. And then, as I mentioned, the regional connectivity symposium will be our next outreach activity. And I did want to just pause and mention that if any of you have thoughts on representatives of environmental justice communities who should be a part of that, we would like to get that information. We have met with and will meet again with the HRTPO Community Advisory Committee for that input as well. But if anybody has some ideas for us, you can channel them through me or Pradeepa or also Matt, so that we can put together a really good group for the discussion of environmental justice benefits and burdens and ways to balance the two before we close out the engagement process. And the very last slide is just, again, a more detailed look. If you read our monthly status reports, we give you this chart in the back. This has a little bit more nuance to it. You can see that we're well underway with our step 3 activities, and then we're planning to wrap up by the end of the summer this year.
Anybody else? Lorna, thank you for a great report, and I think it's very prudent of us to really, given the complexities and the multiple scenarios, identify all of the barriers to success each situation has. So it's going to take some time, it's going to take some effort, and we got a lot of challenges in our economy, but that was a dynamic report. Thank you. Bob?
If I may very quickly, Mayor, so I think that, with the study described, and Mayor Tuck, thank you for those questions and for that background. Sometimes it can be difficult to see all the moving parts, right? Because we're looking at the big picture, but where there seems to be, the process is still playing its way out, but potentially by the end of the summer, where I think we might end up, it appears that this is pointing to 664 and Water to Merrimack Memorial Bridge Tunnel potentially being the next important step, while also keeping all these other options on the list as things evolve over time and seeing what those opportunities might be. Where that starts to fit in then is it can be turned over to Dale Stiff and her team right in time for our long-range transportation plan. Kevin, that allows us to be working with HR TAC to see, what's the art of, can we physically constrain the plan, right? Can we pay for this? It's gonna be a big part of that. But it does give us some direction in terms of, I hate to say short-term steps, but we're gonna be getting into the LRTP pretty quickly here, right? And in a lot of detail. But it does give us some direction. It folds into Dale's planning process. Where we can be working with HR TAC and seeing if we can constrain the Water to Merrimack while still keeping some of these other options, as Pavitra described, in the vision plan for consideration in the future. So, and Mayor Jones, I know we thrown a lot at you today, but thinking about connections on Water to Merrimack to your city and to the peninsula, seems to be that all of the analysis is showing that appears to be a fairly prudent step.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Once again, very good report, and I think now we're at the point for your information. First part is the RCS diary, of key decision points 2017 to present, which is included in the package, and also the draft of the summary minutes from January 2023 meeting with Portsmouth. Okay, at this point, next meeting to be determined.
Yes, sir.
Okay, are there any other items of interest for the good of the order here? Okay, let me adjourn my first meeting. Thank you.